All right, so in this video, we're going to finish talking about the Mongols. So we're going to talk about I guess we'll call this Genghis Khan's legacy is what we'll call this. Because what we're going to do here is talk about the four Mongol Khanates that arose after Genghis Khan's big empire fell apart after his death. We'll also talk a little bit about some of the people who came along after the Mongols that are going to try to recreate what Genghis Khan did. So I think before we get into that, it's probably important to note, and this is also part of Genghis Khan's legacy, is that the Mongols were really adaptable. They used new military techniques. They used new technologies whenever they found them. And whenever they encountered these things, they learned how to use them correctly. To attack their enemies. So there are examples of the Mongols using siege weaponry, things like catapults. Mongols had no need for catapults. They would never have created catapults on their own. But the fact that they saw them and then saw how they were used, they took them and started using them against their enemies, because the Mongols are really devastating on an open battlefield, but if they're trying to attack a city, no matter how many archers on horseback they might have, that's not going to breach a city wall. And so if they figure out how to use a siege weapon, like a catapult, then they can get into a city and get what they want. They also, in addition to being really good at adapting new technologies and military techniques, they also adapted new languages. So they learned new languages and practiced new religions. And this is very similar to what other Turkic people would do. So in this sense, the Mongols were more or less the same as other Turkic people in that they would learn what they could from their enemies or from people that they would encounter. They adapted new languages. They practiced new religions. All right, so the year is 1227, and Genghis Khan has died. And his empire is divided into four pieces that were controlled by his sons or grandsons, and really they're being given to the people that are the strongest fighters, because that's still a Turkic tradition, is that the leader has to be a good fighter. They have to be a good military fighter to be put in charge. And so the four strongest descendants of Genghis Khan take pieces of this giant empire and they make it their own. We'll talk about all four of them, but we're not really going to spend any time on two of them. So we're going to dive kind of deeply into two of them and leave two of them kind of alone. The first one is China. So we did mention that Genghis Khan took over northern China, the non-Song part of China. Eventually, Genghis Khan's grandson, and he takes the name Kublai Khan, takes over the rest of the Song dynasty. And to keep the legitimacy, to keep the Mongols being viewed as being legitimate leaders, the Mongols claim the mandate of heaven for legitimacy. And this is the start of the next Chinese dynasty called the Uwan Dynasty. And it's going to last from 1271 to 1368. Now, we've seen Mongol dynasties, or not Mongol, but Chinese dynasties and other governments that have lasted less than 100 years. And typically when we see a government last for less than 100 years, that typically means that they're not really doing anything to prevent rebellions. And that's what we're going to see here with the Uwan Dynasty. So Kublai Khan was a pretty good leader. Later Mongol leaders in the Uwan Dynasty, however, were not. So Kublai Khan was, tolerant to a degree. And a good administrator. He's also famous for his relationship with one of these Italian merchants, Marco Polo, who we've mentioned in the past. Marco Polo was a kind of a prisoner slash advisor to Kublai Khan. And Marco Polo, when he is allowed to leave China, goes home to Italy. Well, he doesn't. So he goes home to Italy and writes about his travels, which kind of gets Europeans interested in the rest of the world. But we'll worry about that later. So Kublai Khan was, you know, a more or less a pretty good leader of China. Later leaders, however, become more and more intolerant. So later leaders become more intolerant of Chinese traditions. So, for example, you could not marry a Mongol. So, a Chinese person could not marry a Mongol. They could not learn the Mongol language. The Mongols learned Chinese, and so that's how they communicated with their subjects. But Chinese people were not allowed to learn the Mongol language. They dismantled the Confucian education system. And generally just disliked Confucianism. And they brought in their own foreign administrators because they didn't trust the Chinese. And so eventually, the Chinese are going to have enough of this Mongol intolerance of Chinese tradition and Chinese philosophy, and they will start to rebel against the Mongols. It also doesn't hurt that during the Uwan Dynasty, we get a really bad outbreak of bubonic plague, which is also going to weaken the Mongol leadership, but we'll talk more about that later. But with that being said, they were really tolerant of other religions. So Buddhism was fine, Christianity was fine, Islam was fine. So, really, any of the major religions were more or less fine to be practiced in China. They didn't really care what religion you practiced. They weren't going to force their religion on you, and you could practice whatever religion you wanted. In fact, they did really like Buddhism, and a lot of Mongols converted to Buddhism because there were aspects of Buddhism that really corresponded to their own religious or spiritual beliefs. The other place that we're going to take a closer look at is Persia. And in Persia, we call this place the Khanate. So, the Mongols, starting with Genghis Khan, toppled the Abbasid Caliphate in 1253. So Genghis Khan kind of came in and attacked Persia. The Mongols continued attacking the caliphate until Baghdad was destroyed. In 1253, the capital of the caliphate was moved to Cairo. So it was moved to Cairo in Egypt. And once they moved the capital to Cairo, it became a target for the Crusaders. But let's stay on topic here with the Mongols. The Persians, or now the Mongols are in charge of Persia, the Mongols started using Persian techniques for government. Because the Mongols weren't really good at it, and the Persians were experts. So the Mongols came in, wiped out the Persians, and then just started practicing things the way the Persians did. Unlike what we saw in China, the Mongols here really liked Persian culture. And embraced it. In fact, the leader of the Khanate, the leader of the Il Khanate, publicly converted to Islam in 1295. So basically, the Mongols come in, take out the government, and then they just start doing everything the way the old government used to do it. They did the same political stuff, they did the same cultural stuff, and it was like 50 years after they came in, they were just doing exactly the same thing that the Muslims were doing. Eventually, there were some economic problems. Caused the Persians to overthrow the Mongols. But the Mongols just blended into Persian society. So that maybe like 100 years after this, you really couldn't tell them apart. They were now indistinguishable. So they were more or less indistinguishable from the Persians now. They spoke Persian. Most of them were Muslims. They intermarried. And so the children of the Mongols and the Persians looked the same. And so you really couldn't tell the Mongols and the Persians apart anymore. So this is 1253 to 1335. So the two other Khanates that we're going to just briefly mention without going into any depth is Russia. And here we have the Mongols of the Golden Horde. These guys generally settled around the Black Sea. So here's a map. So the Black Sea is down here. So the Mongols kind of set up on this peninsula and down here along the northeast coast of the Black Sea. So this is where the Mongols set up, but they're really controlling this whole area. Now, for the most part, the Mongols just taxed the Russians. Russia was heavily forested. So there's lots of trees in Russia. And the horses aren't as effective in forests. So the Mongols just kind of came up once a year and collected the taxes and pretty much just let the Russians do what they wanted. The princes of Moscow were in charge of the tax collection. And they were also the ones in charge of the rebellion to get rid of the Mongols. And this rebellion is what kind of creates the idea of the Russians. There really wasn't an idea of who the Russians were until the Mongols got there, and kind of fighting against a common foe in the case of the Mongols is what kind of united all of these different people together under the idea of being the Russians. But we'll worry more about these guys again when we come back to Europe in time period 4. And there's one more that we're really not going to mention, but I'll just name it here. There was another Khanate called the Chagatai Khanate, which pretty much just sat in the middle of Central Asia, kind of in between the Uwan Dynasty and the Khanate. So just kind of right there in the middle of Central Asia. But we're not really going to worry about them. So pretty much after about 100 years, so after about 100 years of Mongol rule in Eurasia, they kind of blended back into the nomadic societies they came from. or the societies that they conquered. So within about 100 years of them kind of taking over Eurasia, they were gone again. So really what the Mongols did was they kind of set up a blank slate. They kind of wiped away everything that had been built in time period 3, and they're going to kind of force everyone to start over again. So time period 3 starts with all these classical empires collapsing. Time period 3 is going to kind of end with the Mongols kind of wiping the slate clean, and we all have to restart. So we have to restart the trade routes, which the Mongols begin the process of, mostly to get money. So the Mongols destroy the trade routes, and then the Mongols restart the trade routes. And so the people that follow the Mongols are going to restart the trade routes. We're also going to have to restart or I guess we'll just have new ideas about government, because the Mongols have kind of wiped that out too. One last thing we'll talk about in terms of the legacy of Genghis Khan is that other leaders, or how about we say later leaders, tried to claim legitimacy through Genghis Khan. And maybe the most important of these guys is a guy named Tamerlane. So Tamerlane was around kind of at the end of all of the Mongol stuff. He's going to try to recreate what Genghis Khan did. And he kind of does very briefly. But it falls apart after his death. So after he dies, this recreated Mongol Empire falls apart again, but he's not the last guy that's going to claim legitimacy because of Genghis Khan. So, zoom out just a second, get all this stuff in here. All right, so that is going to conclude our stuff on the Mongols. So I will stop there, and this is Mr. Nissen signing off.